tax preparer, a payroll processor,
bookkeeper, and a business advisor to advise you when you're just not sure what to do.
we will even help you set up your new business.
When you work with Taz Accountants, your own team of accountants is exactly what you'll get, no matter how large or small your business is.
At Taz Accountants, we treat each client with a personal touch.
If you are looking for high quality service, then give Taz Accountants a call on 0121 565 1885
or on 0789066948 or visit us at our Smethwick office.
412 High Street, Smethwick, B663PJ.
Saida Amina Trust's orphanage is taking care of hundreds of orphans in Pakistan. Please sponsor an orphan for £30 a month or £300 a year and help us take care of hundreds of street children and orphans. To sponsor a child, please log on to www.saidaaminatrust.co.uk.
24/7 for your ears only.
صلي على محمد صلي على نبينا صلي على محمد दिल बेचैन
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Current Affairs Show on Radio Apni Awaz. You're listening to Dub on Dub Plus on in Birmingham, Bradford, and Leeds, and all platforms, social media platforms. We're on. Today's topic is not a topic, but an issue that is affecting Europe, Britain, and America, which is the rise of the far right groups and groups that are basically last year we saw with the carnage that was created after the Southport murders, the rioting that took place, where mosques were targeted, refugee hotels were targeted, and there was mayhem. And today we'd like to welcome Rob Hoberman, who is a stand for racism. Hi, Rob. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay, AJ?
Yeah, I can hear you well. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much. Very nice to have a bit of sun on the second day of the new year.
It is a bit freezing as well in Bradford.
It's very cold. It's very cold. A lot of ice around.
Yeah. So why is this protest that's taking place tomorrow? Why is this protest about? I know it's Stop Farage and the Reform Party, but for our listeners who may not be aware of who Nigel Farage is and the Reform Party is, can you obviously give us a brief, obviously, about yourself, and then we'll go into the topic, the issue at hand.
Sure. Well, the protest tomorrow in Leicester is against the Farage and the Reform UK, as you rightly say, AJ. And Reform UK has been surging in the opinion polls. It is a far-right party, as you correctly describe it, part of a pattern across Europe, sadly, over the last few years, which has seen the rise of support for far-right parties. It's not a fascist party. I think we should make that distinction. It doesn't itself have fascist origins, but it has a far-right program. It's a racist party. And Farage himself, of course, has a long history of making Islamophobic comments and other comments more generally against what he likes to call foreigners. I remember not so long ago, he commented that he was on a train in South London and no voices around him were speaking English. I think personally that's something to celebrate about London, and indeed Bradford and Leicester and other places, that we are a multicultural society, welcoming people from many different parts of the world or have their heritage from many different parts of the world, speaking many of the world's different languages. That's a fantastic thing. But for Farage, whether this is a political calculation or what he really feels in his bones, that's something to be opposed. And of course, Reform UK has this very strong anti-immigration racist policy. They want to stop the small boats. They want to stop people who are fleeing terrible conditions, trying to come here to get a better life. And of course, more generally, they make a lot of promises which they simply couldn't possibly fulfill because those promises are contradictory. So we are very keen to ensure that no one is in any doubt about the fact that Reform UK and its leader, Nigel Farage, are racists and they should be shunned. No one should vote for them. And we'd very much like to see their support that they're getting so far around the country go into a sharp decline. So that's what the protest is about tomorrow. They're having a conference in Leicester. Leicester, which, as you know, is a city which again has a large and multicultural society, people from South Asia in particular, but also from other parts of the world. And I think it's quite deliberate that they are holding this conference in Leicester in order to raise social tensions and racial tensions. And again, we are very keen to have a big protest, bringing people from all different walks of life, from all different backgrounds together to protest against this party coming to Leicester.
Yeah, so obviously these guys, you know, they thrive on hatred and division, and they have created violence last year. You know, just after the murder of the 3 girls in Southport, who they blamed the murderer was a Muslim and he was a refugee, and none of that turned out to be true. So, you know, a lot of their views about immigration, that's like key area, immigration. They want to, they keep on telling the British public that we want to bring immigration down. But most of the people that are living and working in the UK, you know, in have a very, very, you know, looking after. Working in the NHS in various sectors, they are from backgrounds that you know, they don't ask the question, are you Muslim or Asian, or when they get treated. So this is like, can Britain do without immigration?
Well, 2 points to make, I think, quickly, AJ, in response to what you say, all of which I agree with. The first is that Farage is clever. He's clever in all sorts of ways. He pretends to be for the ordinary person, although he himself comes from a very privileged background. He was educated at a school, Dulwich College in South London, the fees for which, if you're a day student there, are almost £30,000 a year. That's more than most people earn in this country. So he comes from this privileged background, but he pretends to be for the ordinary person. He's immensely wealthy. He earns £1 million a year. Those are the earnings he's had to declare. Now he's an MP on the parliamentary record. That's much more than any other MP, all of whom, or many of whom, of course, are themselves feathering their own nest. So he's an immensely wealthy person. He also, when the riots took place in the aftermath of the tragic those 3 young girls in Southport, he distanced himself. He said, no, I don't support this rioting. But of course, what he says nonetheless encourages the kinds of attitudes that we saw in those riots. So he immediately said, almost after he'd said, oh, no, I'm against all this rioting, I'm for law and order. He says, nonetheless, the police must come clean about who it is that caused this murder, suggesting that there was some sort of cover, that the police were somehow pretending it wasn't a migrant, which of course it wasn't actually. He also talks about two-tier policing. Now, we're very familiar with two-tier policing because throughout the country, sadly, racism within the police force has meant that people from minority communities have frequently borne the brunt of bad policing, of unjust and unfair policing. That's the two-tier policing we suffered. But he's suggesting, on the contrary, that somehow there's two-tier policing which privileges people from the Black and the Asian community, from the Muslim community, privileges them. For example, when they protest over Palestine and so forth. So his rhetoric constantly fuels the kinds of attitudes that we then saw manifested in violence in those protests across the country, those violent protests. Now, the second thing quickly is just on the general issue of immigration. The fact is that immigration is what makes this country what it is, and it is basically a good country, despite people like Farage being in it and getting support. It is immigration that is ensured that we have any kind of national health service at all. And because Farage's rich friends have not been investing in Britain and growing the economy, actually, it's only on the basis of immigration that the economy has grown at all over the last 15 years. All of the economists say that if you look at what little growth in gross domestic product in the economy of Britain there has been over the last few years, it's come from immigration. And immigrants to this country, of course, are often very well educated, very enterprising. Indeed, in order to get here, crossing the channel in a small boat requires enterprise. These are people who are seeking a better life and to contribute to society in so doing. So immigration is absolutely vital. And of course, they say things like, oh, we're going to reduce NHS waiting lists to 0. But if you stop immigration, if you stop doctors coming here and nurses, you're going to have a much worse health service, not a better one. So their demands are completely contradictory, playing the race card against immigration, whilst at the same time saying they're going to get a better deal for British people in general.
Yeah, just quickly, if you can mention where the protest is going to be held, and then I want to ask about the tier 2 tier policing, because I feel that the riots that took place last year, they were just given short sentences, not really a strong sentencing, compared to what, like you mentioned, what happened in the Bradford riots or any other riots where it was the Black community or the Muslim community or Asian community. They got long sentences. You know, we saw sentences 15 years, 10 years, 15 years. And this is, we feel the other way around, that the tier policing is not doing anything to stop the far right from violence and violent behavior, to stop them and put them away give them a stern sentence so that these kind of rioting doesn't take place again. So just mention, if you mention where the protest will be tomorrow, and we'll just continue with that. But I think we didn't mention it. So it's in Leicester, yeah?
It is in Leicester. If you'll give me a moment, I will find the exact details, because I've not being in Leicester, I've of course completely forgotten what the exact details are, where people are gathering. But they are gathering. They are going to gather outside where Reform is holding its conference, and I will find those details shortly for you. But let me come back to that in a moment. But you're quite right about two-tier policing and a two-tier judicial system. I mean, and many of us will remember the violence that took place, the rioting, as it's called, that took place in Bradford back in 2001, and the terrible sentences that were meted out to all sorts of, overwhelmingly, of course, Asian youth in the aftermath of those riots, and very often on very slim evidence, and where those people's lives were being completely ruined as a result of that. And where the rioting, of course, there was a reaction actually to the provocations of the far right, of fascists who were seeking to come and cause mayhem in Bradford. And we see it time and time again. Even in the most recent protests, we saw two young Asian men given very severe jail sentences for reacting to racist calls and racist provocation. No account being taken by the court of the fact that they were provoked into their reaction by this most disgusting racism, which the courts claim to be opposed to. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not in favor of long sentences for people in general. I don't think prison does people any good. What we want is for people to be rehabilitated, to be re-educated, and those people who engaged in the violence back in the aftermath of the Southport murders, I mean, they need to be rehabilitated. They need to be re-educated. They need to be shown that actually there's a far better way than thinking that someone is somehow inferior or whatever it is because of their race, or that people shouldn't be here in hostels when they're fleeing from terrible conditions themselves imposed effectively by Western governments on their countries through climate change and all the rest of it. They need to be re-educated and rehabilitated. So I'm not in favor of just sticking people away forever and throwing away the key. Yeah. But the manifest injustice of the way in which people, of white people compared to people from other communities are treated, both by the police and by the judicial system, is something for which there's been a very long and a very bad record.
Yeah, just basically mention Nigel Farage and his Reform Party having the conference tomorrow. I mean, if it was a Muslim or a, Muslim organization, they would be straight away banned or barred. If they spoke and incited people to do anything wrong. So there is double standards in the society, especially amongst the elite class. And now just basically, we're seeing the rise of far right in Europe and even in UK. The elite class, are they just the capitalist elite I'm talking about? People like Elon Musk or others, the top, those whose interest is keep people busy in fighting amongst themselves, working people fighting amongst themselves, while they take the resources. The resources are soaked up. Nothing is. People are just they're blaming the foreigners. They're blaming. Saying we haven't got enough money. You've got to pay more tax. And people are being taxed till they they get to right the end of their lives, and pensioners are not given the treatment. The hospital, NHS is not working. Who's going to fix this? What I mean, we've seen the Conservatives and Labour, they come in and go, and no real solution has been posed. So what is it that will solve Britain's problem?
Well, you're quite right again, AJ, as so often. And just before I come on to your questions, let me say that the protest tomorrow, because I've now found the details, I'm sorry I didn't have them off the top of my head, is at 5 p.m. At the Athena in Leicester, which is LE1 1QD. So anybody who wants to go and protest against reform and their racism, it's tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the Athena, Leicester, LE1 1QD. Now, coming back to your points that you've made, Of course, people are very, very disillusioned in this country and across Europe because of what's been happening over the last few years. Effectively, what we've been experiencing is the failure of the neoliberal experiment to try and make economies work more vigorously, to make bigger profits for the bosses, and all the rest of it. And of course, inevitably, it's working people and not the rich who are having to pay for that failure. The rich have just got richer over the last 15 years or so. Ever since the great financial crash and crisis of 2008, economies have been growing very slowly, if they've been growing at all. We've had austerity, as they like to call it, which means cuts in public spending, lengthening waiting lists at the NHS, lower wages, and so on and so forth. But all through that period, the rich have been getting richer and richer and richer. They've seen their asset values, as they like to call them, their property prices and their stocks and shares just going through the roof, courtesy of central banks, which have been feeding money into the system. And it's that resentment against what's been happening and the establishment parties that have presided over it, which has opened the space for the far right to come in and try and make promises, first of all, directing anger away from where it should be focused onto immigrants and minority communities, but also making promises which they can't possibly fulfill. What does reform stand for on the economy? Well, it wants to cut taxes for the rich as though they weren't rich enough already. It wants to free up. I mean, the far right parties have different policies on this, but I think reform wants to basically cut regulations. It's very skeptical about climate change, so it wants to, reduce the kinds of controls over destruction of the environment that we have, which are very minimal anyway. It wants to cut immigration. But it says it also wants to reduce waiting lists and have a booming economy and for people to get better off. You can't have it all ways. And the trouble here is, of course, that it's parties like, well, obviously the Conservative Party under Sunak, but now Starmer's Labour Party in government, which are opening the road. Starmer says, oh, yes, I want economic growth. But he has absolutely no means of delivering it, actually, any more than Reform has. And therefore, things are just going to go from bad to worse. He might not want to call it austerity, but we're going to have even more austerity. There isn't going to be enough money for the health service. The only way you can change this around is in two ways. One is if we do allow the kind of immigration that we absolutely require, both to relieve the situation that people are in who desperately need to come to this country in order to get away from the suffering that they're having, but also to ensure that we have a country which creates enough wealth to go round fairly. But the second thing is we need governments that will fairly distribute the resources. And actually, by taking some control over the economy, ensure that we do have the kind of economy that will deliver for all. That's not, of course, at all on the Reform UK agenda. Of course it isn't, because Farage is above all the friend of the rich. He's the friend of Donald Trump, the billionaire new president of the United States. He's the friend of Elon Musk, the richest man in the world with assets of $400 billion. Those are his friends. And he, of course, is not going to seek any kind of redistribution of their wealth to the vast majority of people.
This obviously, what your message, white working class who are struggling, just like the other communities, all communities are struggling. I mean, the working class, they're out of jobs, there's no jobs around, there's not really a lot of pessimism and, people thinking, we need to do something. And they, these guys come along and say, look, this is the problem, this is the solution, immigration, let's bring immigration down and you'll get your job. But it doesn't work like that. It's basically, people should come together and look at these problems and sit down and obviously we need to talk about how the NHS needs to be is people are thinking, yeah, we'll get rid of the NHS. This is one of Farage's claims that, and the Tories and even the Labour Party thinking of scrapping, austerity measures you mentioned. But how on earth did we get to this point where, where in Europe the far right is it that none of the other parties, the mainstream parties, were able to solve these problems. So it got worse and worse until until now we get this situation. So we've seen from after the Second World War, we saw so that we don't want to be in that same situation where the racists take over. So what can we do? What a message to listeners out there. What can we do? Whichever race we are from or whichever background we're from, how do we understand how we got here?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, AJ, and I wish I had a simple answer to it. But let me start by saying that I think that we need to know how we got to where we are. That's a very important question. And if you go back to the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s, we see the world economy and particularly Western economies getting into the doldrums, high inflation, stagnant growth, what they called stagflation. And the answer that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and others gave to this was what we need to do is to liberalize, we need to free up, we need to roll back the state, not that they rolled back the state very much at all, actually in terms of either spending or in terms of its violence towards people, but we need to roll back the state, we need to allow enterprise the freedom, we need to deregulate finance so that money can flow to where it can make a profit. This was the philosophy. This is the philosophy of neoliberalism. And we've had 40 years of this philosophy. And we've had lower growth than we had before the 1970s throughout that period of neoliberalism. We've had the growth of financial markets, which are now frightening in size. Crossing the financial exchanges every day is about the value in money terms of a quarter of the world's entire production over a year. So in 4 days, you will see crossing the world's financial exchanges, the value in money terms of what is produced across the world in a year. This is absurd. This is an absurd deregulation of the financial sector. And we have speculators rife, we have private equity firms gobbling up companies, putting them into debt so they can make bigger profits. This is the kind of roller coaster casino economy that's been created by neoliberalism. But it wasn't just created by Thatcher and by Reagan. This is the policy that's been pursued also by the so-called more left-wing governments. Tony Blair, effectively, and with his, his great advisor, Peter Mandelson, adopted that neoliberal agenda. A neoliberal agenda, which, of course, as you rightly say, is being brought into the National Health Service, for example, where more and more of it is being privatized, and where the erosion of the National Health Service is forcing those few who can afford it to go private more and more in order to get any kind of healthcare, undermining the very basis on which the National Health Service was established back in 1948. So, these governments, left and right, have presided over this whole neoliberal project, which has failed, which has fundamentally failed. And now, in the face of that failure, the far right is coming in and saying, yes, we need more state, but with it's very equivocal. We need more state here. They make promises there. They're all saying we'll do things for working people because they want the support of working people who are disillusioned. They pretend they're anti-establishment. Farage does. He's a figure of the establishment, but he pretends he's anti-establishment in order to get that support from working people. But they have no policies that will work for working people. Unfortunately, in this country, of course, many people from different communities work together all the time now. They live together, they work together. They come together in protest over Palestine, against racism, against cuts in the National Health Service, in strike action, and so forth. And the way forward, in the absence of a serious progressive left-wing political party, which sadly we don't have in this country, the Labour Party certainly isn't it, is that from below, we just have to come together wherever we can, whatever colour we are, whatever gender we are, come together in order to promote progressive agendas wherever those progressive agendas are under attack, whether it's on education in schools, whether it's around the health service, whether it's around social care, in all those areas. We just need to rise up and fight for the things that we need, that all people need, regardless of race or gender or anything else.
Tomorrow, he's got the conference. What is it going to be about? What have you? Do you have any information about what kind of he's got? What is there a manifesto he's going to be releasing, or he's playing himself as a part? And he's won a few seats, so it is a very serious issue that if this Reform Party gets wins more votes. So what do you think is in his conference? What kind of ideas and solutions, or has he got a manifesto he put together? I mean, mainly it's been about immigration. He's been talking about immigration, stop the refugees, and this is what racism he's talked about. But what is tomorrow in his manifesto? Do we have any details about that?
Well, I think we've well, first of all, let's just say something about the rise of reform, because it is frightening and it's increasing. So at the last general election, just a few months ago, they got the third largest vote. They got more votes than the Liberal Democrats. They didn't get more seats because their votes are relatively evenly distributed across the country. The Liberal Democrats got a lot more seats because the Liberal Democrat vote, even though the national vote was smaller, is more concentrated. But they were the third largest party in terms of votes. If you look at opinion polls at the moment, you see Labour has gone under 30%. They only got 34% in the general election. And that 34%, by the way, was deeply unenthusiastic about Labour. It was mainly about trying to get rid of the Tories, whom people hated even more. But it's now under 30%. The Tories are around about 24%. This is the latest opinion poll I saw. And Reform is on 21%. And if you look at council by-elections, we haven't had any parliamentary by-elections, but if you look at council by-elections, in a whole number of cases, Reform have either won or have come